Realism faced strong criticism in the 90s. It had already faced significant criticism in the 70s, when it was said that realism couldn't explain the economic dimension of the transformations of that decade. But the criticism that realism suffered in the 90s is different. Realism is very concerned with the politics of powers, but it doesn't consider that a power can choose to stop acting as a power. This is a scenario of the end of the Cold War. We have a dynamic of confrontation, a polarity that structures the international system, and in this, several situations can occur. Cooperation can become softer or more intense. One can overlap the other. There may be war or not, but it is not considered that one could give up. In this, international relations theories lose a lot of credibility, and the main theories that emerged in the early 90s to explain this situation don't come from international relations. There are two authors in which one is a sociologist and the other an economist. We have Francis Fukuyama, who says that the end of the Cold War represents a victory for a particular model of civilization, supported by this idea of liberal democracy, and the trend from that point onwards is towards universalizing that model of political organization for the rest of the planet. And we have Samuel Huntington, who works on the concept of clash of civilizations, a book published in the early 90s. He presents the idea that even though this political model that Fukuyama was talking about was actually becoming predominant, it has not erased the fact that other civilizational projects have survived on the globe, in Latin America, the Islamic world, Eastern world, etc. So what will mark the conflict of the coming years will no longer be a conflict of states, but rather between these models of civilization. This is particularly important because a conflict of states is a diplomatically manageable conflict, but between civilizations it would not be. The conflict between civilizations is that idea that there is no way to negotiate between worldviews as contrasting as the worldviews that guide different civilizational projects. In Realism and the End of the Cold War, Wohlforth defends the contribution of realism in the context of transformations, why it is relevant, and what it has to say about these transformations in particular. The author presents arguments around 4 points. The role of realism is to understand the system operating patterns. The hypothesis is about what are the operating patterns that organize the system in the long run. This is not to say that we are not going to have non-standard events. There are anomalous events. They deviate from the standard, but due to the particular circumstances, its impact on the structure is very large. This does not mean that the theory itself has lost relevance. This does not mean that realism has nothing to say about how states compete with each other in the anarchic system. It means that for a particular set, the theory was not able to anticipate a specific transformation, just as we can forge such particular circumstances where in a given space you can build an environment where the law of gravity does not apply. It doesn't mean that the law of gravity doesn't make sense. For example, it could be a situation created in a lab. In very particular circumstances, it is possible to observe an environment in which that law does not operate as it should. It's an anomalous situation. It does not mean that the rule should be discarded as something relevant to understanding the generalized functioning of the system as a whole. Another important point is knowledge a priori and a posteriori. We get used to the idea of a priori knowledge, knowledge that aims to predict the long-term behavior pattern of certain units in a given system. This is a type of knowledge that is consolidated after a long time with a very old science, where a large set of hypotheses have already been tested. We already have a universe of data at our disposal that is very significant, and we have a much greater kind of control over the experiment than we have over the social sciences. Science is not reduced to producing knowledge a priori. Knowledge a priori is knowledge prior to the fact. Science has also an important role of producing knowledge a posteriori, which is to explain after the fact why it happened that way. Realism still manages in certain aspects to describe past reality effectively. It allows you to understand why certain past events occurred a certain way. This is also scientific knowledge. The reason we have little a priori knowledge in international relations is not because realism failed, but because it is a recent science, and as a social science, it is more limited in terms of its ability to obtain consolidated data about the functioning of the international reality. It's still a science in development. In the author's perspective, it makes sense that less consolidated sciences produce more knowledge a posteriori than a priori. This is related to the time scale and not the relevance of the premise. If the other theories also fail to explain a certain event, the criticism should not fall only on realism. Furthermore, if realism was not able to explain a priori these transformations witnessed at the end of the Cold War, none of realism's competitors was able to do so. To discredit realism, there should be a competing theory capable of explaining more than realism has explained. But we didn't have that. Finally, the author also argues that many of the criticisms of realism are related to Wald's structural realism, the idea of anarchy, differentiation of units, distribution of capabilities, which marked the reflection on international relations in the 80s. But the realist tradition goes beyond that. The trajectory of the 80s forced both realism and liberalism out of this structural understanding. They try to develop hypotheses on how this distribution of forces translates into strategy. So there is already a transition. In classical authors, we also have important assumptions about how different authors translate the constraints that mark the role within distribution of power, whether they are powers, middle powers, and translate into effective political action strategies. Morgenthau, for example, contributes in two ways. He said that the balance of power depends on the decision-maker's perception. Power is not exclusively material distribution. The construction of the balance of power depends on the perception of those who make the decision in the context in which they are inserted, that is, on their perception of the current distribution of power. As seen before, Morgenthau argues that power is not fixed. What counts as power in certain strategic scenarios is not exactly the same for other scenarios. It also means that in some cases, power is made up of material elements and non-material elements. So we have the non-material elements that are important for understanding what counts as power in the context of specific decision-making. Wohlforth joins these contributions to say that first, however determinant an event is, it is not sufficient to invalidate any theory, whether in the natural or social sciences. Furthermore, international relations is not consolidated enough to demand from it a single a priori knowledge production. Also, we have no valid competitor capable of systematically explaining the transformations the international system has undergone. And we have more constants in realism. It's broader than what Wald shows us. When we look at all of this, he tries to use some elements of Morgenthau to produce a posteriori theory from the standpoint of realism, to explain the transition from Soviet decision-making in the context of the Cold War. For a certain moment in the 60s, both the US and the Soviet Union reached a certain peak. After that, the American power curve declined more smoothly compared to the Soviet power curve. The Soviet Union has significant growth, but does not exceed the US. After the 60s, there's a more accentuated decline of the Soviet power curve in the author's view. For the author, Americans have always managed their relationship with the Cold War from the standpoint of the concept of bipolarity. For the Soviets, there was a perception of inferiority, since there was a difficulty in overtaking their Americans. It is from this point of view that they make decisions in the context of the 60s. Thus, the Soviets see themselves as an inferior but counter-hegemonic force, and they make decisions based on their perception of their place in the distribution of power. The big question, therefore, is not why the Soviets didn't wage war against the Americans in the 90s, since at that time the gap between them was already wide. If you find yourself becoming more inferior, the tendency is to precipitate the conflict while we still have a chance of winning the conflict. If we're too far apart, it doesn't make sense to face the US anymore. This is the 90s scenario. Therefore, the question to be answered is not why they gave up in the 90s, but whether why they did not give up in the 60s, as they were aware of the inferiority within this power transition. What explains Soviet behavior in this transition is the ideological component that marks Soviet decision-making. The Soviet always assumed that it was dealing with a capitalist system that is marked by inevitable systemic crisis. If we have a context where you are inferior but have chances, why would you refrain from making war right now? If you believe that the crisis of capitalism is inevitable and this is the non-material ideological component of the perception of power that informs Soviet decision-making, if you believe that the crisis will come and that each crisis will be deeper than the previous one, then it is better to try to survive in the game, to make a confrontation under more favorable conditions in the future. In the 90s, they realized there are no more chances. What is the author's objective with this discussion? He presented a theory of how the transition of the Soviet Union took place in the context of the Cold War, based on concepts inherited from the realist tradition. He presented a theory of how the transition of the Soviet Union took place in the context of the Cold War, based on concepts inherited from the realist tradition. He wants to demonstrate that by correctly understanding the dilemma that is imposed in the production of knowledge, and that all nature and social systems have anomalous events, science demands a priori and a posteriori knowledge. Also, it is important to understand that international relations as a science is not realism in particular, and that it is at an early stage of its development, and therefore a posteriori knowledge tends to be knowledge that will develop more easily. He wants to show that realism is not irrelevant. Thanks for watching.